Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Richard Fennell, and I'm the Global Training Manager at Luxion, makers of KeyShot. Today, we're going to talk about a product rendering workflow. So this is the image that was used in the newsletter. So if you like the look of this, this is what we're going to be getting into today. So we're going to talk about first of all, some overall kind of model prep, some reference images, and then we'll dive into KeyShot and kind of compose this image that you see here. So uh, first, let me take a look at our model. So the model that we're going to be using today comes courtesy of Dimensiva.com. So if you do a search or take a look through their website, you can see that we have these BO Play H6 headphones by Bang & Olufsen. So I downloaded this model. It's got a couple of different formats, and we'll talk about that. But this is the model that you can use. It's free, so you can just download it and do whatever you want with it, basically. But we're going to use this as our reference, or we're going to use this as our model in this webinar and go through it. So anyone who's watching along as we're working today, go ahead and type questions into the chat. And good morning or good day to everybody who's already chimed in. So go ahead and ask your questions that way. We're going to go through the entire workflow today, and then we're going to address questions at the very end. So if you've got them, feel free to send them over. Also, this webinar is going to be recorded so that you can watch it on YouTube later. But yeah, so other than that, we'll go ahead and get started. So if you download this model, it's going to unzip and it's going to look something like this. So here's an actual rendering that somebody else did, whoever packaged this together. And we're not going to reference this one too much, but that's in there. And then we have a couple different types, or we've got FBX models and OBJs. And today we're going to be working with the FBX file. It also includes some textures, and we'll come back to these because we're going to use some of these in our workflow today. So I just want to mention that's the model we'll be working with. Also, what I've done is go out, and I think I just grabbed most of these from Amazon. But in order to get a nice rendering, something we want to do is actually have images to reference. This is a good practice whenever you're working on any project. In this case, we want to take note of some of the material details or some breakouts or things like this. So we'll have this handy as reference. But that's a good starting point that I would suggest you have. Take a look at product photography. Most of these, I think, are photography. Not totally sure there. If there's some renderings, they've done a pretty good job with these. But I'm betting a lot of this is photography. So that is always a good starting point. We'll reference them for our material breakouts as well. So I'll go ahead and once we've gone through that, we'll come back to these as well. But let's hop into KeyShot. Let's import the model, and let's talk a little bit about workflow. So the file that I'm going to be working with is, out of the ones that I downloaded here, I'm going to start with the FBX file. So this is already tessellated data, and I'll just go ahead and drag and drop that into my KeyShot session here. So I'm going to keep basically everything at the default here and just hit import. For this, since it's already tessellated data, we don't need to worry about any of the import options. And that comes right in. And you can see that it's got somewhat of my structure. A lot of this is already, or the issue here that I can see already. I'll be using a lot of hotkeys as we work. I'll try to call them out. If you ever need a reminder of the hotkeys, you can hit the K key on your keyboard, and that'll pop up a window with the KeyShot hotkey. So K for keyboard. Again, I'll try to call those out as I use them. But if you can see here, we've got some issues. For example, like these parts are they've already been grouped in the modeling software and they aren't broken out. So we'll dive into the geometry editor to actually break those portions out. I'm also going to go into performance mode, Alt P, or this little icon here up in the ribbon. Performance mode allows you to, or it quickly turns down all the render settings so that we see a faster representation of what we got here. So the parts are all broken out separately. But then they're not differentiated by material. So if I change one, I'll just do that really quickly. You can see what's what. So it is decently well broken up. One thing that you'll also notice, if I zoom out here, I've already got an environment set to go. This is kind of one of my go-to environments. Under the studio folder on the library on the left-hand side, this is 3 panels straight 2K pretty sure it's actually the one that I used for this rendering. Not totally sure. But if you ever want to change your default environment, you can do that just by going up to Edit and Preferences. And here under Preferences, there's the default startup environment. So out of the environments under Studios, Panels, Side Panels, I've got 3 panels straight 2K, and that's my default that I've set up. So that's just good to know, because that way you have a little bit better of a starting point whenever we get into KeyShot. So what we're going to do today is we're going to run through this model. We're going to break out some surfaces. We'll talk about textures and materials. If you've seen any of the recent webinars, there might be some stuff that's a little bit familiar to you from a material standpoint. But let's go ahead and dive into it. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my references here, because we want to actually, if I'm not designing this, if I'm just, in this case, I'm really just rendering it, I want to see what it looks like in real life. So something I can tell almost immediately, and I'll snap this window to the side over here, is that this part right here, I'm not sure of the nomenclature on this part, but this part here is it needs to be broken out a little bit better. This chamfer in the image is polished, as opposed to being looks like a brush or a spun finish. So what we want to do is we want to use the geometry editor to break that out as a separate piece of geometry. If you hold Alt when you click on the little checkbox next to a piece of geometry, it will show you only that piece of geometry. I can actually do that in the real-time window as well. If I hold Alt and click once on a part, it shows me only that part. So you can see, first of all, we're going to need really 2 things here. I want to break these out as 2 separate pieces of geometry, first of all, and then I want to go in and I want to break out that chamfer as a separate piece of geometry as well, because then I can apply a different material to it. Right now, if I go in and I assign some material to this part, for example, here, you see it's all one big thing. So let's break that out. What I want to do here is right-click on my model, and then I can select Edit Geometry. So this will bring up a geometry view window. I also get a warning that says, editing geometry breaks updating and live linking. I'm going to have to live with that, because I don't have this model to live link. So I'll hit continue, and now I'll get this this pick editor mode. So we're going to need to do this twice, no big deal. But what we're going to want to do first is we want to separate, or we want to split separate objects. We want to take these 2 parts and turn them into 2 distinct pieces of geometry. This is great if you're using something like a poly modeler or a mesh modeler, where this is a common occurrence. So that's why I wanted to focus on it for just a second. We want to split separate objects, so I'll hit next. And then now I can just select on a piece of geometry. You can see here, I can click one and I can hit split object, and you can see that now we have 2 bodies. And when I hit done, we have 2 separate objects in our scene tree. So we've got our 2 sides, left and right. We can also use the geometry editor to break out those chamfers. So that's what we're going to do. So I'll right click on my model, hit look at, so I can zoom in on this part right here. So now I'll right click and I will edit that geometry. Again, I get the window that warns me. Normally I would hit don't show again, but I want to make sure that we get that warning, and you're aware that you can't use live linking or update geometry functionality if you do indeed start breaking out your geometry. Now what we want to do is split some surfaces. So I'll hit next, and then I'll zoom in on my model. If you ever get to the, if for some reason you can't see your model, just right click an empty space and hit center and fit model, and now we can zoom in. So our model that we brought in is tessellated mesh, or it's a triangle mesh. Looks something like that. I can enable that by hitting the show wireframe button. What this tool will do is, if I click, you can see that it's found one of those triangles, and it's going to do some calculations based off the splitting angle to define the neighboring triangles. Okay, what that really means is that if you click anywhere on your model, it's going to try to break out surfaces. If you're not happy with the surfaces that it's seeing as, or the sets of triangles it sees as one big surface, click on a triangle, and then you can decrease your splitting angle. So here I'm just hitting the down arrow a bunch of times. Since this is actually kind of a rounded corner, it's going to take a little bit more work. But you can see here, what this splitting angle is doing is it's defining the cutoff for that geometry. Anything smaller than 20 degrees will be seen as one piece of, or as one surface. So here, if I click, you can see I now have two big surfaces and the small surface. That's because my splitting angle is at 20. The splitting angle is gonna depend on your geometry. If I had a nice clean 45-degree chamfer, I just hit 44 degrees and boom, it just cut that right off. This is actually rounded over, so that's why I need a smaller split angle. But now I could select that. I'll remember my splitting angle of 20, and now I can hit split object. So now if you can see here, we've broken out our geometry into two separate pieces. And so I'll hit done. And so now for this part, you can see I have two, I guess, kind of sub parts within that group. So now I can assign whatever material I want to those. I'm going to do the same thing with this part over here. I'll right click on it, hit edit geometry, ignore my warning. Again, I'm going to split object surfaces. Okay, since this was based off of our previous camera, I can't see it, so I'll center and fit model. Now I'll go ahead and zoom in, hit next. And now with my splitting angle set to 45, I don't see anything good, but I can just go in here and I can type in 20 for my splitting angle. And when I click on that chamfer, there we go, I should see that surface. I could split it, hit done. And now we're good to go. I've broken out that geometry as needed. Again, if you've got questions while we're going, just type them into the chat, and then we'll be following along with all the questions as we work. But I could have done that with just by editing all the geometry, but what this gives me are two separate groups. So if I wanted to do an animation or something like that, these are nicely grouped. It also means that these are all unlinked materials. So if you can see here, I can now assign whatever material I want to that surface, which can be tough to do sometimes. So I'll right click and hit show all parts. I've broken that out. So let's run through some of our materials. So first of all, let's take a look at this is kind of what we want to replicate. So we want to make the version that's got, I guess, kind of this tan leather with silver and white accents. We'll try to recreate that the best we can. So it looks like this top part here is leather, ear cups are leather, the mesh here is white. So let's start breaking this down. This model has been detailed pretty well. Someone took some time in here to, for example, model all of the stitching. It's not super complex, as you can see, but it does add a lot of complexity to this image in a really nice way. That's if I zoom in, I can actually see that fabric. I get asked all the time if there's an easy way to do kind of stitching or fabric. No, this is absolutely the best way to do it. The more detail you can model in, the better control you have over your materials. So let's talk about this mesh here first, because I want to touch on a small but important point. So if I double click on this material, you can see it's a diffuse material. So a diffuse material means that when light hits it, we don't see any sharp reflections. It's going to be diffuse, kind of like a piece of chalk. So fabric, or in this case, this fabric doesn't really have a lot of reflectivity to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into the nice folder that was provided to us. And here you can see there is a folder full of textures. And I want to call this out specifically because there we go. We have this textile. That's a really nice texture. We can just take that, and from Windows Explorer or from our Finder in the Mac, I can drag and drop that texture directly onto my model. When I do that, I'm going to use it as a diffuse texture, or our kind of basic color texture. You can see here that I'm starting to see I've got a seam there. Well, for any of you that are working in workflows that allow for UV unwrapping, so if you're bringing in models from 3D Studio Max or Rhino, since I know a lot of our users are using Rhino, my suggestion is find out about UV unwrapping, because what UV unwrapping allows you to do is it allows you to take this kind of complex curvature in our geometry here, and under my mapping, I can change the mapping type from a box map to UV coordinates. And when I do that, now my textures are going to wrap basically exactly where they need to on the surface. This is not done by magic. So if you have not assigned the UV coordinates in your model, then if you do this, you're not really going to see much of an effect. But it is a suggestion I can give you if you're working with a modeling package that allows for UV unwrapping and UV assignment, then do that. KeyShot will take it. So all the Rhino users out there, take a look at UV Unwrap, because it is a great feature that you can take advantage of. So we've got that texture, looks okay. It's wrapped exactly like we need it to. And for everybody who's using a CAD modeler who can't do that, we'll talk about other texturing techniques as well. But I'm going to take that texture. I want to also apply that as the bump. So I want it to replicate my peaks and valleys on that surface. So if I hold Alt and I drag the diffuse texture, now it's also going to apply it as a bump texture. And if I get out of performance mode, I'll start to see some more shadowing on there, because even if I turn off the diffuse or the color texture, now you can see that it's picking up the peaks and valleys using the bump texture on there as well. So now I'm using the same texture for both, and you can do that for almost any texture. KeyShot just pulls the grayscale values to represent the bump height. Okay, so we've got that. That looks good. It's called textile strip. We'll keep it as that name. Now let's talk about our leather, because not everybody has access to nicely UV unwrapped models. So let's say these ear cups here. This one does have a leather texture, but we're going to ignore it. Let's say we're bringing in a SolidWorks model, and we don't have access to UV unwrapping. Well, I can double click on that material to edit it, and you can see the material name is leather headphones. And this is the same material that's also going to be on the top up there. We can use procedural textures if you don't have access to UV unwrapping. Procedural textures are they're math-based textures. They're vector-based. They're not based off images. If I change, I'll keep this as a diffuse material. Actually, no, I'm not. I'm going to change this to a plastic material for now. I want to walk you through this workflow. But I've set it to plastic, and you can see that the plastic is now being defined by two colors. Our diffuse color, which is, again, if you think of that piece of chalk, it's the color of non-reflective color, or not super sharp reflections. But I can change that to some color. Specularity, the specular color, that's how reflective it is. So I'll back down on that reflectivity a little bit, and I'll add a little bit of roughness. So now we have a red, shiny, but slightly rough material. So here what we can do is we can go to our textures. And instead of loading an image texture, which you would do by clicking this little checkbox, the little window pops up, we'll ignore that. For the diffuse texture, I can hit this little drop down here, and this is where our procedural textures live. These 3D textures are going to wrap over your geometry regardless of the shape of your geometry. So if you've never poked around in here, definitely take a look at that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select the leather. And now I can see here, let's take a look at that scale. We might have to scale it up. Looks like it's teeny tiny. Scale of 1, too small, 10, too small. Don't be afraid to add in an extra 0 every once in a while. Oh, that looks like it's a little too big, so let's try something like 50. There we go. So now I'm never going to see seams on this because it's a 3D texture. It's wrapping this texture over our entire model. And I want to get the color just right. And so for this one, and I want to focus on our kind of beige leather. Well, if this is what that leather is supposed to look like from a color standpoint, well, then I can just go in, and when I select my colors, I can just use the eyedropper tool. So I'll hit the eyedropper, and I'll select a color there, hit OK. That's the color of kind of my the raised bump. It's not really a bump, but the raised portion on my leather. Now for color 2, I'll find a similar but slightly darker color in here, right? Maybe not darker. There we go. I'll get this a little bit closer so I don't have as much of a variation. So now those two colors are pretty similar. But yeah, so the leather is going to be defined by two colors, color 1, color 2. I can use the same trick I did before now that I've got my color defined. And if I hold Alt and I drag the texture from diffuse over to bump, it's going to duplicate it. So now if you look at that edge, you can see I actually have my bump texture, and I can control the height on that. Oh, too much. So let's go back down to something like 0.2. So now I've got a leather texture. It's seamless. It's going to wrap on my geometry. And even though this is a lovely texture, if I was unhappy with the texture, which I know I probably would be on this model, I can use the procedural texture instead. I'll bring this window back, hit F to go in full screen mode, and we're good to go. So I'll get out of performance mode. That looks good with shadows. I tend to toggle this back and forth. And again, because this is procedural, I could always adjust those colors as needed. I want to apply the same leather material to this top headband portion right here. So I can right click and I can copy a material. And now I can right click on what is now the red part, and I can paste a linked material. That means it's the same material being applied to both. And that's leather headphones. So if I want to tweak those colors, I just look back. I look back at the actual rendering. This looks much lighter, or our product photography should show this as being a little bit lighter. I can go in and again, since it's a procedural texture, I can adjust those colors. Again, this is why it's important to reference geometry, not just another rendering. So I can then go in here. Let's lighten that up a little bit. We'll make it more of a tan-ish leather, right? And so now with those a little bit closer, we're getting a little better. We'll desaturate that as well. Ooh, maybe not that much, right? But now we're getting a little bit closer to the intent with that leather. So we've got our ear cups. We're good to go. We've got some other materials that we need to assign, and like our fabric, or excuse me, our thread right here. So it looks like this thread is a little bit lighter. So what I can do is I can just double click on it. It looks like it's a light gray. Just toggle back to that. And it looks like it's not really gonna match that too much. I could just use, again, I can just use my eyedropper tool to sample a color, select a color here, and then I can just desaturate it and lighten it. So that way I'm basically in the same color family. So I've got the same hue for those. So it's pretty light, but now I've got my yellow stitches, and that's going to give me some contrast. We've got some more parts in here. I'll double click on this one. I'll go back. There's actually a really nice fabric, this black textile. That one's included. Again, even if you don't necessarily need to render this model, the fact that it's got some great textures in here is a big plus. So you could download it and borrow their textures for your renderings. I'll just drag this over and I can apply it to that material, and I'll do it as the diffuse texture. And again, I'll duplicate it and I'll just scale this one down. I know this one is UV mapped, but I'm gonna ignore that for now. We'll just keep it at the regular box map, and that should work just fine. So now I've got my fabric texture on the inside. So we're cruising through our materials here. So let's take a look at some of these other materials. First of all, let's focus on what is, I'm assuming, either a bead blasted aluminum type of material, or it's some sort of painted finish, which is these parts right here. In order to get that material looking just right, I'm going to use a metallic paint. So our metallic paint works like a true kind of automotive paint. It's going to have three main variables. So I'll go to metallic, I'll get a basic, paint metallic black. Let's try this and let's apply it. So those three variables are going to be a base color, a metal color, and a clear coat. So right now it just looks kind of like a paint. So again, eyedropper tool. Man, I'm realizing how much I use this. For my metal color, I can just use the eyedropper tool and sample a color. It doesn't look close yet, even though this is a metallic paint. This metal coverage defines how much of our surface is covered with a metal flake. This is basically like density. So watch what happens if I increase this metal coverage slider. Now I've got a lot more of that metallic flake visible on the surface. The material still looks too dark, and that's mostly because this base color is set to pure black. So I'll lighten that up, and now I can get something that's a little bit closer. There we go. So with both of these being light colors, this one I'll probably lighten a little bit as well. There we go. Now we're getting a little bit of a pop there. And our metal roughness is going to control the play between our base color and our metal color. So we want to add a little bit of roughness there. So that's looking pretty good. You'll notice if I let this sit for just a second, that I'm getting some material roughness, and I'm also getting a highlight on that material. And that's because this material has a secondary clear coat. This doesn't look like it has those sharp reflections, so I'll back those out. But this is a great way of getting those plastics to have a clear coat on top to them. So that's looking pretty good. A few quick tweaks: base color, metal cover, metal color, metal coverage, metal roughness, clear coat roughness, and we're looking pretty good. So that's fine for now. That looks good. And just for the sake of organization, I'm not going to call that paint metallic black. The in-scene material that we're using is currently called that, but I'll just call that silver paint, just so we know which one it is. I'll hit F, go back in a full screen mode, and then I can copy and I can paste that material. Oop, copied the wrong one. So if I shift left click, I can copy a material, and hold shift and right click. Now I've pasted a link material. So now we're good. We're working our way through it. Okay, so looks okay. The last kind of material we need is going to be in here. So we've broken out these two separate faces, right? Just to call that out again, we've got those. If I find them under the scene tree, again, I can just hold Alt, click that checkbox, and now we can just see those parts. So let's talk about this part. Again, this one included some textures with it. I'm going to ignore these because it included our brushed metal as a texture, and this isn't going to give us really realistic results. And it also has the logo here, and I want to have those as two separate things. So what we'll do is we'll make the material without having to use this image texture, and then we'll throw the logos on there using labels. So right now, if I double click on my material, this is a metal material. I just threw some random anodized material on it. So it's just the color with a little bit of roughness. So I'm going to back down on that, make it nice and shiny. Because what I want to do is I want to actually, if I want to get like a spun or a brushed metal, I'm going to use one of our advanced metal materials. And to change it to that advanced material, I hit my drop down right here, and I go to the anisotropic material in our drop down. And if I select it, this is our advanced metal material. So this is how you can get good control over your brush materials. We spent some time on this with our metals webinar. So this material is going to be defined by a base color, which you should always set to black. Our specular color, which is, if you think about it like the metal color, this is the color of our sharp reflections. In our preview here, it looks like that's something like aluminum. So I think the color that we have here is pretty good. But a big thing that we can do with this material that we can't do with any other material is we can define the roughness with X and Y values. The reason that's important is if you look at this texture, it's got its radial finish has this kind of sharp highlight that shoots out in some directions. It's a circular or radial highlight. So if I go back into KeyShot, you'll notice that under the mode, I can change the mode to radial. Radial will give me the appearance that I'm looking for. So if I hit radial, it looks a little bit different. But now what I want to do is I want to hit the position button, because this allows me to click and position my radial highlight wherever I want. And if I zoom in here, you can see I'm getting it a little bit. So what I'll do is I'll back down on one of these, let's say roughness X, and let's increase the roughness Y. And now I'm getting that material. Again, no texture. I'm just doing this by changing the roughness of the radial reflections in some particular direction. I'll decrease the roughness just to show you this, but if you, let's say for example here, have roughness Y, and you get these kind of circular finishes, that's a very different effect, and sometimes we do want this. But in this case, I'll just set the roughness X to 0, roughness Y to something like 0.1, or I can type in 0.2, and I'll get these really strong radial reflections. So that's my radial finish. So I will give it that name. So I'll call it radial, let's say radial metal. Cool. So now I've got that material. It looks good. And for this part right here on the chamfer, I can just, I can go back to my metals. I can take just a, let's say a chrome, a basic chrome, and I can throw that onto my part right there. And now you can see we have that chrome detail and that highlight broken out, or the edge broken out. And we're still getting our nice radial finish. We're not going to throw a texture on it just because we're working quickly. I don't need another texture. I'm getting the reflections that I want. So let's talk a little bit about labels. So I mentioned this briefly, that this texture had the B&O logo built into it. What I did is I just went online and I did an image search for, Bang & Olufsen logo. I got one, and I brought it into Illustrator, cleaned it up a little bit, and then I exported it as a PNG because I wanted it with transparency. So we could have our white logo with transparency. So if we're going to apply that onto our part, I can just grab it and I can drag it directly onto my material. And this time, I'm not going to apply it as a texture. I'm going to add it as a label. So when I click Add Label, you can see now it's trying to scale to my model. And for now, I'll hit the little green checkbox here because I want to talk about labels. Labels follow normal projection. That means whenever you're looking at a surface, what the label does is it tries to project onto that surface. And it does it using your current camera as the kind of the reference point. So this is doing something weird. It's not big enough, so I can scale this down. but you'll notice it's bleeding off onto this part right here. Well, that's because if I go to my scene information, you'll notice that this was modeled in centimeters. Whenever you're working with a label and you're working with normal projection, there's a slider for depth. This controls how far onto the surface that label is being projected. So the depth slider is the reason that if you were to put a label on a thin piece of glass, you may see it on both sides. If you don't want to see it on both sides, then we can just decrease the depth. If you want to see it on both, then you can increase it. But normal projection is influenced, one, by your camera angle and then by the depth slider here. So that's something that affects the positioning. Additionally, something that's really overlooked often is this little DPI checkbox here. If you create artwork and you export a PNG with transparency, which is how I recommend you work, PNGs or TIFFs, never ever use a JPEG, right? But if I hit DPI, you'll notice that this scales up to some huge amount. Well, that's because I exported this at a really high DPI. And if I know that DPI and I type it in, it's going to give me a one-to-one representation of that label. This is a little bit bigger than the actual product photography. Here you can see it's a little bit smaller. I didn't know the actual size, so I just said, hey, this is 1 inch at 2000 DPI. So then if I scale it down, this would be half an inch. Right? So that's half an inch at 2000 DPI, and it's a one-to-one representation of that label. A new thing for KeyShot 6 is also the ability to define the materials for your label. So for this, let's say it's a painted finish. So I can just change that to paint, and now that material is going to be applied to the label, and this is a paint. Depends how far you want to get into the workflow. I made a quick bump map as well for this. Basically what I did was I made it to gray, and I set a little bit of a shadow onto it in Photoshop, and a kind of an inner shadow. Because then when I apply this, I can apply it as a bump texture, and the bump texture reads those peaks and valleys, white as a peak, black as a valley. And now if I zoom in here, you can see that I'm getting that little bit of raised edge, and I'll decrease the bump height here to something like 0.2. If I change this temporarily to metal, you'll see that now I'm getting those really, without the bump map, it's totally flat. With the bump map, now I'm getting a little bit of an edge to it, and you can change the roughness. You can do all sorts of stuff. In this case, I'm just going to change that back to paint. So now I've got a paint label on there, and again, even though I have that defined, I'll line up my camera normal to the surface. I'll go back to my mapping. I'll hit position, and I can click to position it. So now something like this. In this case, I'll just eyeball it, but now we've got our logo on that part. Coming over here to the right side, I want to apply the same thing. So I'll right click, and I'm going to copy the material, but big difference here is I'm not going to paste a linked material. I'm just going to paste the material. This gives me a second version of that material. So if I double click on this one, you can see now I have radial metal number 1. This first one is just radial metal. So I'll double click back on the second one that we applied, or the second copy of this material that we applied to this part. This is a separate version of that material. So now I can go in and make changes to it. And the reason I did that is because I want to reposition the center point of that spun finish. And you'll notice it doesn't affect this part over here. And now I can go in, go to my labels, use my position button, and now I can apply the label where it needs to go. And now I have two separate materials with two different labels, but they look very, very similar. Last thing I want to do is I want to apply that nice sharp, or this chrome here. So again, I'll copy, shift left click, and then zoom in here and shift right click, copy and paste the link material. So now I have that chrome in these two separate radial finishes. Now I'll right click, show all parts, and our model's coming together pretty well. And if I take a look at the list of my in-scene materials, I basically know what all of these materials are, which is pretty good since we've gone through and we've basically made most of them. So I'll right click, look at model center, and now I'm looking at the center of my model itself. So some geometric point right here in the middle. So we've got all materials good to go in this. This metallic paint, I'll actually make it a little bit less reflective. There we go. That probably matches better to what I see in the picture over here. So slightly less metal. All right, perfect. So our materials are good to go. Again, if you've got questions, type them into the chat, and we will get back to you as soon as you type those. So we've got our one model. Let's talk a little bit about kind of our composition. What we want to do is we want to set up an image that looks something like this. It doesn't have to look exactly like this, but we want to get it kind of close. So in order to do that, first of all, let's take a look at our canvas size. I've been jumping in and out of full screen, and during that time, my window hasn't resized itself. The output that I want to actually create is going to be something like a 1920 by 1080 rendering, something that looks good on a screen or a TV. So what I can do is I can plan for that. If I go to my image tab, I can use a resolution preset that matches my kind of desired output. So on this screen, I'm working with 1920 by 1080, so I just worked with a smaller version of that, 1280 by 720. These are all broken into aspect ratio. So here, these are 4 by 3. These are common screen sizes or TV, so you can see 480i, 480p, 720, 1080, right? So these are TV or display sizes. These are going to be 19 by 10 aspect ratio or common screens of a slightly different ratio, paper and mathematical ratios. So if you know that you want to output to some ratio, set it here, and then make sure you check lock aspect and lock resolution. Because then if I go in and out of full screen mode or resize my window, it's going to stay the same aspect ratio. And in this case, also the set image size or resolution. So that's a little bit about the setup there for my image, because then I can just work essentially in a smaller version of my final canvas output, and then we can use that to compose our image. My environment, I'm not going to worry too much about because I've got a decent starting point. Let's get out of performance mode so we can actually see this object with the shadows. And in this case, something I'm going to do, because I noticed it in kind of our starting rendering, is so this image was no Photoshop, just rendered out in KeyShot. It's got some interesting stuff happening here, like reflections on the ground plane, but those reflections aren't super sharp. So if I go back into KeyShot, you'll notice that here I have ground shadows and ground reflections. And if I toggle that, you'll see I see sharp reflections. And even if I put this onto a dark background color, which is the best way to make those shadows pop, you'll notice that there's still sharp reflections. So how do I get blurred reflections? Well, easiest way to do this is going to be, if you've never worked with an added ground plane, this might be a little bit new of a workflow for you, but this is awesome. I tend to work this way all the time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off ground reflections and I'm going to turn off ground shadows. Curious, right? But now I'm going to go up to the edit menu and I'm going to add a piece of geometry and I'm going to add a ground plane. The reason I'm doing this is because when I add a KeyShot ground plane, you'll notice that all of a sudden I get ground shadows back, even though my ground shadows are turned off. I'm going to ignore this because I'm done with my built-in ground shadows and ground reflections. But what that edit geometry and add ground plane has done is it's actually added a ground plane here to my scene. There's now a piece of geometry. And it's a special piece of geometry. It actually blends into the background, regardless of whether that's a backplate image or my environment. If I toggle back to my environment, E for environment, you can see it blends onto the environment. I'll hit C to toggle back to my color. But if I now double click on my ground plane, it brings up the editor tab because I'm now editing this material that's applied to my ground plane. So what I want to do here, if I want to add reflections, as you can see, I now have a super customizable material. And in this case, shadow color, keep it at black. Specular color. The specular color controls the reflectivity. So right now it's set to black, which means it's non-reflective. So what I want to do here is I want to make it reflective. And now you can see that I'm getting reflections on my ground plane. Cool. Well, now, since this is our ground material and it's got more control, I can also add roughness. So once I've done that, now you can see that those reflections are getting broken up a little bit. So this is something that I know gets done a lot in Photoshop because people don't necessarily know that this is in here. But now if I increase some roughness, now I'm getting those reflections broken up a little bit. So reflections, but rough. So there we go. Now we've got our fancy kind of ground plane, and there's all sorts of cool stuff you can do with that. You can texture it, you can add labels. There's so much you can do there. So now, if I go back to my environment, my lighting looks good. I'm not going to mess with this too much, and I just have, I've got a color as my background, and then we're good to go. So lighting, I'll just set this to product, and actually I'll keep it at basic because I don't see any appreciable difference. Basic is going to be a little bit faster. I want to set up a camera so that we're looking at our models like this. And in this case, you can see I've got 3 of them. Well, I don't have 3 in my current scene. So let's go back and let's use the pattern tool. Right now, I'm going to turn off my ground plane just so it doesn't get in the way. But I'm going to select this piece of geometry, and instead of duplicating, I don't tend to duplicate very often. Actually, I don't duplicate unless I accidentally hit duplicate. What I tend to do is I right-click and I use the make pattern function. This can only be done on the model level, not on an individual part level, but this allows me to create instances of my geometry. They are faster, smarter, better, right? What they are is when I hit make pattern, they're referenced geometry. So if I want 3 of these, you can see my little triad has popped up down here. Let's say I want 3 of them in the X direction. I just type in 3. Now I have 3 of them. These are better than duplicating because they are lightweight. They're not actually duplicating your geometry. They're just referencing it. And they tend to be more reliable than the duplicates are, especially when you start updating geometry, things like that. There's also a slider for spacing, so I can control the distance between these. So if I do something like 20, which I'm going to do because I'm going to rotate some of these, but now they're 20 centimeters from center point to center point. So the spacing here is reliant on your in-scene units. So centimeters, 20, and I'm good. I'm also going to turn off resize environment because I don't want it resizing my environment. And then I'm good. I can hit OK, and then now I have these 3 models all in the same scene. So if I hit this top one, it's going to be on the left, this middle one in the middle, this bottom one is representative of my one on the right. So what I'll do here is let's go in and let's quickly set up our scene. So I'll set this one here, or I'll select it. I can go to the position tab. I can use my move tool and I'll rotate it. I don't want to accidentally hit scale or translate, so I'll turn those off. If you didn't know that's in there, that's pretty cool. Now, if I rotate it and hold shift, it's going to snap it to 15-degree increments. So let's rotate it to 30 degrees. That looks good. Now I can select this part right here, use the move tool, hold shift, snap it to 30 degrees. And now I'm going to have something really similar to what I had before. But again, holding shift when you snap, shift plus left mouse button will snap to 15-degree increments. Okay, so I'm good to go there. So we're getting pretty close. This one is also bigger, and it's not bigger because it's scaled. That first one is actually bigger because I selected it, and then I just grabbed it. I enabled translate, and now let's move that out. And if you notice this again is unit aware. So that's actually the number of centimeters. So I can type in something like 20. And so now that's going to be bigger because it's out in front. It's a little bit too big, so let's go over to our camera tab and let's start making some adjustments to our actual camera. First of all, I'm going to back this out so that it's something like a 70mm lens, or how about 50? There we go. That looks pretty good. We can see the R, we can see the L, we can see all the logos, and we can line this up. So I'll bring back my ground plane here so we can see what our composition is looking like. That's looking pretty good. They're all sitting on the ground. I want them to kind of float. So now what I can do is I can multi-select here by holding down shift, go to position, use my move tool, and move this whole, move the whole set of objects slightly up. So now I'm getting closer to what I'm looking for. Now if I go back to camera, I can right click and I can hit look at model center, and that's going to snap to the center of my geometry. And that's actually looking pretty decent. So that's decently close. Looks something like that. Right, so now we've got our object in the middle, and our distance, I'll just type in, I just like solid values, so I'll type in 80 and minus 90. And now we're looking directly at the center of our geometry, and we're lined up with our correct camera at a focal length of 50. I like this camera, so I'm going to add a new camera. I'll call this Dark Studio 1. Perfect. And then I can lock this camera. So now we're good to go. One big difference between this part, this image and what we've got is that our materials are not changed. So I have to work on our color variant on the left and on the right-hand side. So in this case, let's start with the left-hand side. We have our camera, so I'll toggle back over to free camera. Again, I'll go into performance mode. This is going to be a little bit faster way to work. I can select this model here. Again, hold down Alt when I click on that checkbox, and now I've isolated it. Perfect. Actually, let me undo that because I wanna show you something here. If I right click and I show all parts, this is everything in my scene. And if I go to my in scene materials, you can see I now have three versions of textile, three versions of textile strip. I've got three versions of everything. And this is okay, but I want to be able to manage my materials a little bit quicker. Something you can always do if you have let's say one model selected, you can filter what's visible in your in-scene materials. So if I hit this little filter icon, I can filter by scene set, which I'm not going to do right now. I'm going to filter by visibility. Now, this only shows me the materials that are visible. Kind of cool. It's a great way of quickly focusing in on the materials at hand. So in this case, I want to, actually, let me go back to my reference images. It looks like this is black on black on black. Yep, so this is our really dark version. So then I can just go into here and I can either double click on my materials here, or I can go in and I can edit these materials. But essentially, I'm just gonna go in, I'm just gonna make a dark, or a really dark leather. So we have our black leather, and I'm just going to run through this really quick. I think everybody kind of gets the concept, but we're just going to, this is one easy way that we can start working with our variants, right? So this is just going to be our murdered out option over here. I'll double click on this, darken the paint, and darken the metal reflections just a little bit. So that's got some nice dark contrast to it. Perfect. If I double click on this material, I can darken the specularity, the reflectivity, and back that down. So now it's nice and dark. Since the other side isn't linked, I'll do the same. And I think that was right around the 50-ish% mark. I've got my fabric here, which I want to darken. Since this is applied as an image texture, something I can do is I can just go to the diffuse texture, and here you can see I have brightness control for that image. And this is just like going into Photoshop and darkening it. So let's put that down to like 0.1 brightness or 0.05. That too dark? No, that actually looks pretty good. Bingo. So now we have our dark version. Our middle version is going to stay the same because that's what our reference was. And then our version on the right, this is slightly different. And let's see what that's actually going to look like. This one is, I think it's the white and leather version. There we go. Oh, it looks like we've got some rose gold or gold. Not totally sure, but let's just whip this one up really quick. So we're gonna set our colors on this leather to white. So I'll double click on it. Again, I can just go in and little shortcut there. You can click on this this icon to take you directly to the texture. Excuse me, and I'll set that. I almost never, ever use pure white for my material colors. I'll generally back those down to a very light gray, because that way you can get a highlight on white. So our leather looks good white. Our material here, I'm going to increase the brightness of the paint and maybe add a little bit more paint visible so we can see a big difference between this and the material next to it. Cool, so we've got that. And it looks like this is going to be kind of a gold color. So I'll, oh, these are both linked. So I want to break those out. So it looks like this top portion here is going to be gold. So I can select it. And when I right click, I can unlink this material. If I double click on it, now I can go into my colors library, and handy, I had the metals open already. So I can just take, let's say 18 karat gold, drag it over to our metal color. It's still not good enough, so let's throw this on as a base color as well. That looks a little bit too saturated, so let's darken that a little bit. Oop, nope, keep it light. Again, I'm working really quick. I could use my eyedropper tool, and I can finagle these a little bit more. Actually, both are still a little too saturated. There we go. So it's a little bit desaturated. It's not actually really gold unless the B&O folks tell me otherwise. So now that we've got our gold, we can use this. Let's say I want to match this color here. My metal color, I can just drag it from my palette down here. And then if I double click on this material, I can go into my specular color and set it to match. So now it's the same color. Really handy. In this one, I don't know. Yep, it looks like my chrome part is also the same color. So I'll double click on it. And then when I go to change my color, again, grab that gold color that I saved down in my temporary palette. We're looking pretty good here. So that's white leather, that's gold. I think that's good. Should be good to go. Yeah, looks pretty good. So now we have our different material variants. And again, I can go in there and I can finesse these materials a little bit more, but I want to work a little bit quicker. So I'll go up to my ribbon, turn off performance mode, go to my camera, go to my dark studio, make sure I've got my ground plane turned on. Any other quick adjustments here? No, I don't think so. I think we're good to go. So I've got my materials all set up. I'm using a stock lighting environment. It actually looks fine. So if I look here, I'm getting decent reflections. My camera angle is what I want it to be. So we're good. Maybe I would go to the image tab. The only thing I might tweak on this is throw in a little bit of a vignette, maybe. Yeah. All right. A little bit of that might look okay, and I'll get rid of my bloom. But yeah, so that's kind of a quick run through on setting up one of these product shots. I know I talked through it. You could probably do this a lot faster once you've got the workflow down. But I tend to break it into chunks. I take a look at the materials. I take a look at my composition. I set up my camera. I set up the scene. And then, yeah, we're good to go. So if I just need to kind of render this quickly for an email or a presentation, generally what I'll do is I'll just let this sit, and then I can hit the screenshot button. Under Edit and Preferences, you can change the format of your screenshot. I do that. I change it from JPEG to PNG and bump up the quality to 100. I do that always because then I have a higher quality image when I save it out. JPEG is inherently lossy. But yeah, so if I let this sit, looks good, then I can just hit the screenshot button. And now you can see I've changed some settings that's asking me where I want to put that. So I'll just go onto the desktop and I'll save this as BO headphones, hit save, and then now that's saved out to my desktop so that I've got that image there. But yeah, so we'll go ahead and open it up for questions at this point in time. But otherwise, thank you very much for tuning in. And if you found us on YouTube, please don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's KeyShot. It's youtube.com/KeyShot3D. And yeah, stay tuned for questions. But again, my name is Richard Fennell. Thank you very much for tuning in today. And yeah, thanks a lot. See you next time.